Good morning. In commemoration of the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Abhedananda, a direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna and the third spiritual leader of the Vedanta Society of New York, we are pleased to announce a special lecture series on religion and philosophy during the year 2018. A flyer with details on the schedule of lectures is available in the lobby as you leave. Swami Abhedananda came to take charge of the Vedanta Society of New York in August 1897 at the direct request of Swami Vivekananda. He gave a well-received series of lectures traveling extensively throughout the United States, as well as places as far apart as Alaska and Mexico, and was acclaimed as a great exponent of Vedanta and Hindu thought and culture. He crossed the Atlantic no less than 17 times to teach Vedanta in England and France, and all the time he was writing on philosophy and religion. His complete works span 11 volumes. After a long and very successful tenure in the United States, Swami Abhedananda returned to India in 1921. The schedule of talks is as follows. Today we welcome Dr. John J. Thatamanil, Professor of Theology and World Religions at the Union Theological Society here in New York, who will speak on the harmony of religions. On Sunday, April the 1st at 11 o'clock, Dr. Miri Al-Bahari, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Western Australia, will speak on Buddhism, Advaita, and the perennial philosophy. On Friday, April the 13th at 7:30, Swami Chaitanyananda, the minister in charge of the St. Louis Vedanta Society, will speak on Swami Abhedananda. And on Sunday, April 22nd at 11 o'clock, Professor John Stratton Hawley, Clare Tow Professor of Religion at Barnard College, Columbia University, will speak on Bhakti in historical perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. A few words to introduce our speaker this morning. John is, as you just heard, a professor of theology and world religions at the Union Theological Seminary. He is especially interested in comparative theology. The question, how can Christian communities come to see religious diversity as a promise rather than a problem? He is very interfaith himself. He practices Vipassana meditation, and his specialization, his passion is Advaita Vedanta. So you can see we get along well together. But also, when I went to his office at the Union, I was amazed to discover the books on his shelves. We have many of the same books which I have on my shelves. Another area of common interest is, strangely enough, Buddhism, and especially Madhyamaka Buddhism, the Shunyavada, which is the fundamental philosophy of Tibetan Buddhism. So he specializes in that. He has a great interest in that. His book was on constructive comparative theology. The book was The Immanent Divine, God, Creation, and the Human Predicament, an East-West Conversation. So this provides a foundation for a non-dualist Christian theology, like a conversation between Paul Tillich and Shankara. He is working on another book, The Promise of Religious Diversity, Constructive Theology After Religion. And there's also another book which is mentioned here, which he's working on, Theology Without Borders, Religious Diversity and the Theological Method. He is a past president of the North American Paul Tillich Society. He has an interest in process philosophy. I think that might be one reason why you are best friends with Professor Jeffrey Long. He loves process philosophy too. And he is co-editor of a book series from Fordham University Press on comparative theology, thinking across traditions. He blogs for Huffington Post, so you can catch up on him with him on that. He has taught different kinds of courses, including one on Gandhi and King. Religion, a theological engagement with theology. So we welcome John in our midst today, and we look forward to his talk on the harmony of religions. By the way, that was a placeholder, a general topic which covers the theme which he's going to take up this morning, but he'll have his own take on it, as he always does. John. Please welcome John.
I see that there's a strategically placed clock right here so that no speaker waxes too eloquent. I'm grateful for this invitation, and I'm particularly grateful for Swamiji. He is, I think many of you can tell, not only a brilliant interlocutor, but he has a genius for friendship. You just want to be in his presence. And so I hope I get invited many more times so I can have excuses to spend time with Swamiji. So let me get right to the work here. First of all, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm profoundly honored to be in this historical space with connections directly to Swami Vivekananda himself. So anyone who is aware of the history of this place will feel a certain awe and trepidation before speaking, given the legacy and luminous speakers that have preceded me. So I'm somewhat nervous, but but I also know I'm among friends. So now I come to you as a peculiar creature. I am a Christian Advaitin, and I've written a book on the possibility of a Christian Advaita. And so I do feel that I'm among spiritual kin, even if my Advaita takes a Christian inflection. At the heart of my work, as Swamiji mentioned, is the question, how can our various traditions learn from each other? I seek to ask what has to be true about our traditions if genuine learning is possible, especially if that learning is meant for the sake of mutual transformation. In a world in which so much of our talk about religious diversity is caught up in discourse about religious diversity as a problem, that diversity somehow is intrinsically problematic because it is bound to lead to conflict and the so-called clash of civilizations, it's really high time, I believe, for us to make a shift from that kind of discourse to religious diversity as a promise. And that, of course, is part of the great legacy of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So that's the sort of overall frame in which I think and work, and that is the basis for my talk today. I want to begin by acknowledging a fortunate failure. Some weeks ago, Swamiji, in proper form, emailed me well in advance asking for a title, a specific title for the lecture. Captured as I was in a frenzy of busyness, but because I'm far less efficient than Swamiji, I was unable to respond in time for your newsletter and publicity purposes. So Swamiji placed this open-ended title, The Harmony of Religions, as the topic for the day. And as it happens, this title is very suggestive and very fertile. And it's precisely about that topic that I would like to speak. In particular, I'd want to speak about this word harmony. I want to suggest that far too often, those who speak about the harmony of the religions don't really mean it. Rather, they are advocates of sameness. And sameness is not harmony. Let's begin by consulting a dictionary definition of the word harmony. Some of these definitions include A, the combination of simultaneous musical notes in a chord, as in, she taught him how to sing harmony. B, the structure of music with respect to the composition and progression of chords, as in a song with complicated harmonies and rhythms. C, the science of the structure, relation, and progression of chords, or a pleasing arrangement of parts, congruence, agreement, accord, even tranquility. Now, what strikes me as noteworthy and important here is that harmony, although it might mean congruence, agreement, accord, or even tranquility, never means simply sameness. Where two people are singing precisely the same note, there is no harmony. Now, of course, much more could be said about harmony, most of which as a non-musician I am not qualified to say. But for my purposes today, I want simply to state that harmony requires difference or diversity as the condition for its possibility. What then might the notion harmony of religions mean? What might Vedantins take the phrase to mean? I want to begin by suggesting that a great many moderns, both within the Vedanta tradition and outside the tradition, have generally not believed in the harmony of religions, but in the sameness of religions. That might sound like a provocative claim, and I suppose it is. One that would require a great deal of time to demonstrate and substantiate. But nonetheless, I'm simply going to claim that it is true. Now, to be clear, no knowledgeable person can simply fail to see or dismiss the sheer variety of human religiosity. Rather, my claim is that many have treated this diversity as a problem to be solved because of the conflicts generated by it. Because diversity claims have generated conflict, a common strategy on the part of pluralist philosophers and theologians is to posit that there is some underlying sameness or identity beneath the superficial play of diversity. This sameness or identity is then taken to be more real or true than apparent diversity. In Advaita Vedanta circles, this strategy is employed to resolve the conflicts between those who hold that Brahman is a personal divinity, as opposed to those who hold that it's impersonal, or a term I much prefer, transpersonal. So is Brahman Saguna Brahman or Nirguna Brahman? And as most of you in this hall know, the typical strategy is to say, by all means, encountering God as personal is valid. Brahman with qualities, Saguna Brahman. But this is only a penultimate truth. The absolute truth is Nirguna Brahman, Brahman without qualities. And the argument usually goes something like this. Saguna Brahman is how Brahman appears with limiting adjuncts, in the classical Sanskrit term, upadhi. But when those limiting adjuncts are seen as either illusory or less than fully real, one understands that the highest truth is Nirguna Brahman. This is definitely like bringing coals to Newcastle. This is all stuff that you know. Now let's consider that particular strategy and ask whether it can be seen as a way of harmonizing the religions. Now, first, let's recognize that such a strategy does have the merit of recognizing and to some extent honoring that many hold ultimate reality to be personal, and therefore give themselves in bhakti to ultimate reality so understood. But, and secondly, the argument nonetheless proceeds to downgrade the validity of bhakti as only provisionally true. It is true only so long as one takes the various limiting adjuncts to be real in the same sense that Brahman itself is. And when that when that mistake is recognized, bhakti directed to a personal God is subsumed to jnana, knowledge of Brahman as the ground of world and soul. This strategy has been described by the Indologist Wilhelm Halbfass by the term hierarchical inclusivism. The truth of devotional traditions is included, and recognized as valid, but only as a lower level in a hierarchy. So it's hierarchical inclusivism. Can such hierarchical inclusivism be recognized as a case of harmony between the religions? I genuinely want to ask you that, and you can tell me what you think, but I suspect you know what my answer is. Right? My answer is no. Why? Because although two notes are sung and recognized, only one note is understood to be fully and finally true. Hierarchy is not harmony. That's my claim. Now, I can imagine some of you, especially those of you who are given to philosophical habits of mind, raising the following objection. You might be thinking, but John, surely there's no way to harmonize two logically incompatible claims. Ultimate reality, in the final analysis, must either be personal or impersonal. You can't have both. Otherwise, if you had both, what you would have is not harmony, but dissonance. Such a claim seems eminently logical and incontestable. Our desire for harmony cannot be purchased at the cost of cognitive confusion. But is there no way to hold both claims together? That's an important question to ask with the pictures of these people in mind, because I think they did, in fact, manage to hold these claims together. I suggest there might be, and we can find a clue to it in the 14th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. I'm most Sundays a Christian theologian, so when I preach, there's always some scriptural text, so this feels like Sunday, so I have to have some kind of text to ground my reflection. So I'm turning to chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita, particularly verses 3 to 4, and then verse 27. I'm reading this in the translation of Professor Laurie Patton. Son of Bharata, the great Brahman is my womb. In this I place the embryo. From that emerges the origin of all beings. Son of Kunti, Brahman is the great womb of all forms that exist. I am the father who places the seeds. And then verse 27. I am the support of Brahman, the immortal and imperishable, and the support of everlasting dharma, and the support of absolute bliss. That's really presumptuous for a Christian theologian to talk about the Bhagavad Gita before this audience, but I'm hoping you will bear with me generously. Now, these verses strike me as really fascinating, and I suspect they haven't been the subject of sufficient theological reflection. In all three verses, the personal Lord, in the Gita identified as Krishna, claims to have a relationship of inclusion with Brahman. Krishna claims either to contain Brahman as his womb, or claims that he is Brahman's support, basis, or foundation. Read straightforwardly, that is without appeal to the bhashyas, which try to spin the text in one way or the other, the plain meaning of the text seems to be that Krishna, the personal absolute, holds that there is an impersonal or transpersonal dimension to his being, namely Brahman, which is his womb. Here, Krishna not only managed to combine the personal and the impersonal, but in a queer case of gender bending, articulates an intersex divinity. The grammatical cases here are wild. The neuter Brahman is the male Krishna's female womb, yoni. Hence, the divine life is meaningfully and truly encountered as both personal and transpersonal. A playful outsider, that's me, might suggest that these verses imply that the ultimate might rightly be understood as male, female, neuter, and intersexed. So much for the exclusively male language for God that is too often the case for Western Christians. He, Father, 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 right? This is such a rich text, not only for the way in which it works personal and impersonal, but the way in which it complexifies our gender discourse about divinity. So what are we to make of these verses if considered apart from the various bhashas? I was thinking that, to really put you to sleep, I could have spent the next chunk of time just sort of working through the various bhashas to show you how Ramanuja or Shankara comments on this, but you would be all fast asleep by the end of the time. So I'm avoiding that and just looking at so-called straightforward meaning of the text. Well, the most obvious reading of these verses is that Lord Krishna is arguing that he is a complex unity in diversity. One might say that Krishna claims to be a harmony. Isn't that interesting? God tells us that he is both personal and impersonal in different dimensions. Although he is personal Lord and thus the object of bhakti, there is within him a dimension that is impersonal or transpersonal, namely Brahman. The great Lord calls himself the support, basis, or foundation, the Sanskrit is pratishta, of Brahman. Now this discourse is likely to strike Advaitins, and if there are pure Kevala Advaitins in this room, there's one. It's really strange for the personal Lord to claim that he is the pratishta of Brahman, because it's usually the other way around. But not in this chapter. For now, let us put aside the question of ontological priority so that Swamiji and I don't come to fisticuffs about how to read the Bhagavad Gita. And turn our attention to Lord Krishna's more intriguing and unusual claim and how that pertains to the theme for the day of harmony between the religions. For there to be a diversity of claims about divinity that fall neither into contradiction nor simple sameness, I argue that something like Lord Krishna's basic claim must be true. There must be diversity in divinity. If there is no diversity in divinity, then only one true claim can be made about divinity. There would be no need for harmony. A genuine diversity of claims must, under those conditions, somehow be resolved or dissolved, lest dissonance arise. As I have argued, the typical modern Hindu strategy refrains from holding that apparently contradictory claims about divinity are simply false, but usually adopt the strategy of arguing that some of these claims are provisionally true. They're vyavaharika satya, not paramarthika satya. So, Advaitins typically hold that claims about God as personal are not ultimately true, and Vishishtadvaitins and Dvaitins hold just the opposite claim. These strategies may be better than holding that some claims are just flatly false. But in both cases, I want to argue you still don't get harmony, only sameness. It doesn't matter which of these you are. If you're a Vishishtadvaitin and say, well, claims about ultimate non-duality are only provisionally true, you still are holding to no position that looks like harmony, at least as I would argue it. And that's precisely what Lord Krishna does not do. Instead, he says, I am both personal and impersonal. And far be it from me to argue with Lord Krishna. And because what Lord Krishna says is true, then more than one rather strikingly different claim about God or Brahman can be made simultaneously, right? In harmony, you have the simultaneous, not ranked order, a simultaneous presentation of diversity that are held together in unity. That's how harmony arises. So, the conclusion to be drawn from this series of observations in this first part of my talk can be simply put. If there is no diversity in divinity, there can be no harmony either between or across religious traditions. I'm sorry, either between or within religious traditions. I want to suggest in the time remaining that if we're to genuinely hold to the possibility of harmony between religions, we need to adopt some version of Lord Krishna's claim about divinity. Strangely, this has not been a customary strategy, either within Hindu circles or in Western circles. Until recently, this strategy has gone untested. And I hope perhaps that a serious reading, for example, of these verses from the Bhagavad Gita can inspire academics and religious voices from other traditions to think more seriously about the possibilities for interreligious and intra-religious harmony. Now, I want to ask, why? Why haven't we thought about the possibility of holding a kind of harmony claim, arguing that we can have a harmony between the religions only if there is a harmony within divinity itself, and hence there must be diversity within divinity? Why not? And my intuition is that we have been compromised by the nature of the metaphors we use when we think about religious diversity. So I want actually to think about metaphors with you for a little bit. Before people get to concepts, often thought itself and the possibilities for thought are shaped by the metaphors we use. The dominant metaphor that I think people have used, certainly in the West, and I would argue perhaps also in Vedanta circles, for thinking about religious diversity, is basically the image of paths up a mountain. Right? This metaphor imagines that the various religious traditions are paths up diverse paths up one single mountain. Now, there's some variations on this metaphor. Rivers flowing to the same sea, planets orbiting around the same sun. Right? But those latter two are really just variations of the one single mountain metaphor. Right? One mountain, many paths. There is a real diversity of paths, but the end is single, one and the same. The means may differ, the end is identical. But if the end is identical, then the difference between the paths are really relatively indifferent. The path you take up the mountain really doesn't matter so long as the end is the same. You see how that's not a metaphor that is conducive for discourses about harmony.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
What do you mean by diversity in divinity?
That there is real diversity in divinity. For example, when Lord Krishna says that I am both personal and impersonal. So that's at least two things, right? So must be diversity in divinity. That's what I'm saying. And the metaphor of the mountain with one single end at the top of it seems to run contrary to any discourse that might imagine that there's a diversity in divinity. There's only diversity in angle of approach, not in the destination. At the destination, all is oneness. That's, again, the way we tend to imagine how we can think about religious diversity. The means may differ, but the end is one and the same. I want to suggest that we need better metaphors. Because under the constraint of such a metaphor, we will never arrive at a thinking of harmony. I know of only one thinker who has, using this mountain metaphor, changed the possibilities within the metaphor itself. And that is a famous Hindu Christian theologian named Raimondo Panikkar. Panikkar says, well, the mountain itself is the reality to be explored. So the paths themselves cannot be separated from the top. If you remove the paths, the top would fall. Right? So the paths that one takes to divinity are part of divinity. Right? Now suddenly we have diversity again. But most of us don't get so subtle with this metaphor. Right? Only, as I said, only one person. In Christian circles, a friend of mine named Mark Heim has suggested it's high time to think that there are many mountains. That perhaps the various religious traditions are climbing different mountains entirely. That's an intriguing idea, but I don't think that makes for harmony either. That seems to prioritize diversity over any kind of unity, although he's more subtle than that. The trouble with the metaphor is it seems to give way to diversity over unity. I want a metaphor that holds together diversity in unity for the sake of harmony. I see a hand.
Ramakrishna himself used the metaphor of the ocean, and the ocean is obviously diverse in different places, and he said that it's the bhakti that consolidates a form of that impersonal ocean into a personal God. So like that itself kind of substitutes.
We'll hold the questions till later.
Oh, but I welcome it. Yeah. It's a lovely, that's an example of a more subtle frame of reference. You know, there is one other metaphor that is surprisingly little attended to, and it has impeccable Indian credentials. Found first in the Buddhist traditions, it is the old metaphor of the blind man and the elephant. Right? Now, this metaphor has fallen out of favor in intellectual circles for a variety of reasons. And I want to talk a bit about the reasons why that metaphor has fallen out of favor, and say that almost every challenge raised to that metaphor can be met intellectually. But first, I want to just say a quick word about how I was taught to reframe this parable. Swamiji may have heard me talk about this in one of my video lectures. A theologian who was himself blind told me that I should heretofore reframe the basic parable. And he's British. His name was John Hull. And John Hull said, "John, no blind person would actually make this mistake." You see, John, the blind are capable, and they simply have to move patiently over the surfaces of things. Because for the blind, knowledge is diachronic, not synchronic. Right? The sighted person imagines he takes in all things at once, but the blind must move patiently over the surfaces of things and over time accumulate a picture of what he might be seeing. And given the patience with which we proceed, no blind person would actually make this mistake of grabbing onto one part of the elephant and claiming to know the whole. So if you are to use this parable henceforth, you must either say that you are referring to sighted persons in a darkened room or blind, folded persons who are not accustomed to working by means of touch. Isn't that subtle? Right? So, first of all, we should know how we use and become mindful of our use of disability discourse around the senses. Because blindness is routinely used as synonymous with ignorance or foolishness, as in, for example, the phrase, the blind leading the blind. And Hull says, the blind don't make such mistakes. They can't afford to. So, let's now speak then of blindfolded persons and this elephant. Now, in this story, and here I'm going to use a translation. I'll just read the customary way the story goes, though you know it. This translation is by Jeff Long, whom you mentioned. So, in the story, it goes like this, usually. One grasped the ear and declared, "The elephant is like a large fan." Another grasped a leg and declared, "Elephant is like a great pillar." Another found the trunk and feeling it proclaimed, "Elephant is like a snake." Another grasped the tail and declared elephant is like a rope hanging from the sky, while another, grasping only the tuft of the tail, said elephant is like a broom. A sixth encountered the side of the elephant and maintained elephant is like a wall. The seventh insisted that the others were all wrong, for he had grasped the tusk. He proclaimed, elephant is not any one of those. Elephant is like a spear. Each, being certain of the truth of his own experience, began to fight. Now, here's the turn of the tale. A person who was not blindfolded chanced to come by and found them quarreling. After listening to their individual perceptions from their different points of view, he gently explained that there was no need for fighting over the issue, for each was partially right. But to have complete knowledge of the nature of the elephant, he said, one would have to be aware of and combine all the different aspects of the creature. So that's the usual way the story is told. Now, crucial to my reading of this tale is that each blindfolded person truly registers some aspect of the elephant, and so rightly says something true. It is like a rope, it is like a wall, and so on. Hence, the diversity of perspectives is a positive good. Each is right about what he affirms, but wrong about what he denies. Error results from overreaching. Conflict arises for a variety of reasons. Each cannot imagine the possibility that he might only be partially in the right. Each therefore assumes that he wholly knows the whole. Each cannot imagine that the elephant might be a complex reality with many aspects. Consequently, each one cannot imagine that the others might also be right in a way that does not presume that he himself is mistaken. He assumes that if the other is right, I must be wrong. To each blindfolded person, diversity of judgment is a sign of error. How can there be harmony under those conditions, right? Each also fails to register the limitations of the language or sign concept he uses. The ear is not a fan. The ear is only like a fan. Nonetheless, despite the inadequacy of the sign concept, provisionally true knowledge is granted to each, and each seeker grasps an important feature of the elephant. Now, great care must be exercised when this allegory is employed as a means for thinking about religious diversity. And when care isn't used, those who object to this allegory have a reason to object. In Christian theology, theologians such as Leslie Newbigin, a bishop who spent considerable time in India, are quick to note that no one can claim to stand in the position of the all-seeing passerby or the king. That is the problem with this tale, says Newbigin. The tale only works because there is some person, other than the blindfolded person, who claims to see the whole. But in the world of religious life, who can make that claim? So here Newbigin writes, the story is told from the point of view of the king and his courtiers, who are not blind but can see that the blind men are unable to grasp the full reality of the elephant and are only able to get hold of part of the truth. The story is constantly told in order to neutralize the affirmation of the great religions, to suggest that they learn humility and to recognize that none of them can have more than one aspect of the truth. But of course, the real point of the story is exactly the opposite. If the king were also blind, there would be no story. The story is told by the king, and it is the immensely arrogant claim of one who sees the full truth, which all the world's religions are only groping after. It embodies the claim to know the full reality, which relativizes all the claims of the various religions and philosophy. You see the problem? He says this is an arrogant tale, even if it's told for the sake of humility. Somebody sees the whole, and if there were no such person, the story could not be told. Now, Newbigin is, of course, right, but only partly so. True, all without exception stand within some partial and limited vantage point. But the one who proposes the allegory appears to violate the constraint of particularity. Hence, Bishop Newbigin levels the charge of arrogance. However, the allegory I suggest is meant only to suggest how it might be that the traditions are severally warranted in the claims they advance, and yet also have something to learn from others who propound claims that seem at first blush radically incompatible. Most importantly, I think the allegory is best understood not as a claim to secure knowledge, but rather as a picture that functions as a hypothesis. A picture that functions as a hypothesis that, if sustained, can help us to imagine how persons within traditions can hold on to their own claims, although some reformulations are likely to be necessary, even as they learn from very different claims. For that reason, Newbigin is wrong to hold that the tale is meant to neutralize the affirmation of the great religions. Not in the least. The tale suggests that many, if not all, of these affirmations are likely to be true and important, even if only partly so. So, there are many more things that I could say about the problems that people have raised about this analogy, but that should be significantly enough to suggest why that allegory should not be dismissed. Newbigin is right. There is, in fact, no all-seeing person. And any person who proposes this picture, this metaphor, this allegory, is only proposing a hypothesis. A hypothesis that allows us to both acknowledge the truth of what we have come to know, and yet also be open to the claims that others also advance. In this and through this kind of allegory or metaphor, we imagine how it might be possible for us to remain grounded in our own claims and yet also open to learning from diversity, so that a genuine harmony between the religions might emerge in the future through the work of interreligious learning. So let me stop.